It's the most wonderful time of the year by Andy Williams there on BBC Radio 6 Music. It's like about 4 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. I reckon Phil's pulled in some new Christmas beds for me, which is like a nice Christmas present. He left them wrapped under the desultory 6 Music. It's not so much a tree as a twig, really, in a little pot with a lot of fag ends in it. Don't even allow smoking in here, so we don't know that happened. Anyway,
Merry Christmas. It really is the most wonderful time of the year, isn't it? We do so love it. Eggnog, port and sherry, all before 10 a.m. Please drink responsibly.
I hope that you got everything that you wanted. Didn't mean that to sound as menacing as it did. I'm Shaun Keaveny. I don't know if I've said that. Well, the thing is, the reason I said that, Phil, is because a lot of people might have got DABs for the first time. You know, they might just be firing them up for the first time. So, I didn't realise it was the Radio 6. Oh, what's this garbage? They'll say when they hear me. Luckily, my what do they call them? New Year's resolution to be not self-deprecating doesn't kick in until the 1st of January. So here he is, dumpy and boring until 4. But it's not just me, thank God, because another thing under the tree, lovely, beautifully wrapped in brown paper, actually, because that's more recyclable, with a paper bow, is our Two Brian's special that we now do every year. It was inaugural about 3 years ago. I think it's our third one. Fourth. I can count. Brian who? Brian Cox, Professor, and Brian Eno. Two of the great Brians. One in the field of music, one in the field of physics. Their two minds come together with me sort of in the middle, like the ampersand, you know, connecting them. The lukewarm water between fire and ice. We sit atop the needle of the BT Tower and discuss all manner of amazing topics. And I try and butt out as much as possible because, you know, not really that intellectually a heavyweight. So that's what's coming up. But in the meantime, don't text in. I'm obviously not here. You think I am? But please enjoy the music and that. We've had Andy Williams, which is one of my favourites. Let's go a little bit indie now and have I Wish It Was Christmas Every Day by that one off of The Strokes, who always sings a bit distorted. Julian Casablancas. Somebody should get him a new microphone for Christmas. Christmas is about two things: tradition and presents, and turkey or nut roast, and the trimmings and port and Christmas songs and vapid commercialisation, overindulgence, tat, fake snow, desultory grottos, dogs in fake antlers, and physicists and legendary musicians up big towers. Everybody knows that. Well, it's definitely about tradition and presents. And here I've got a present for you and a tradition. This is, I think, the third, am I right? The fourth annual Two Brian's Christmas special. This time, right up the Christmas tree needle of the BT Tower in London. It's a shame it's radio because you wouldn't believe what we can see. I'm here with Brian's Cox and Eno. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
And happy Christmas.
And may I say a happy and warm Christmas to you two as well. Just to paint the picture, guys, we are up the top of the BT Tower. I know for a fact that Coxie has been up here because very flashily you threw a party up here and I came. I don't have much memory of it, though.
No, we were talking about it earlier. Yeah, we managed to borrow it. Bizarrely, I now have no idea how that happened, but we managed to borrow it for our 10th wedding anniversary party.
Don't belie your ignorance by trying to guess the actual year and get it wrong.
I think it was 2012 because I think that this place was opened up for the Olympics back in 2012.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And do people realise that we're rotating very slowly?
What? It's quite disorientating.
Yes, it is. It's disorientating because they've got some pictures hanging from the ceiling, which in fact seem to be slowly coming towards you, whereas in fact the whole room is turning.
And the middle section is not. So we're on the lip section. So we're moving, and the middle of the room isn't, and then the whole of London's moving, and it's all a bit strange.
You can actually hear it probably in the background. I don't know, but you can hear it groaning and creaking, which is slightly disconcerting.
And it rocks a little bit as well.
Until you mentioned that, I hadn't noticed either of those things. Listen, I walked past the poor guy at the bottom whose job it is to turn the handle to keep it going round, and he's absolutely knackered, and the day's just started. So we'll take him a cup of tea in a minute. You've not been up. Is this your first time up the
First
Beaton
time.
Tower, Brian?
First time, yeah.
A novel?
I didn't even know it was still capable of turning. I thought that had stopped in the 70s, because there used to be a restaurant here, didn't there?
Apparently opened by Billy Butlin.
A great man in English cultural history.
Is that a joke, or is that
It's
true?
apparently true. The
So Billy-
Butlins used to run it.
Wow.
Butlins?
Used to run the restaurant.
Did they?
And this brings us on to Brian's story about the Butlins, the fact that apparently people used to complain about the sizes of the portions at Butlins, but they had a novel response to that.
In fact, it was Billy Butlin's idea. When he heard about these complaints, he said, just reduce the size of the plates. And that's what they did. They chucked away all their plates and got smaller ones.
It's a brilliant idea, and there's going to be a lot of brilliant ideas floating around over the next couple of hours, obviously. I'm going to warm us up by asking a really dumb question. What's the most exotic Christmas that you have spent, Brian Eno? Must have had a few.
I can certainly remember the least exotic Christmas I've ever spent.
That's so
Perhaps
Brian.
I should start there.
All right.
When I was young and I had left home, I would sleep around on people's sofas, and one Christmas I ended up sleeping on the sofa of a girl I knew, but it was in fact her little family's terraced house. And in the morning the family came down to the Christmas tree and in fact found me in a sleeping bag on the floor in front of the Christmas tree. She'd sneaked me in late at night, you know. That was a very uncomfortable situation. I didn't feel happy there.
How interesting, though, that I would have thought millions of women and men over the years, when asked, what do you want for Christmas, would have said Brian Eno under the Christmas tree. But way back then, somebody actually got it.
Somebody got it and didn't appreciate it at all. I had to leave after breakfast.
Ask for a bite, Mum. What is this guy doing here? So that's the least exotic.
Least exotic. I'll work on most exotic.
All right, we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
I like the least exotic, actually. But I'm sure that Brian Cox has got something quite spectacular.
No, I think, as far as I know, I've spent every Christmas, all, 50 of them or so, at whatever home I was at, I think.
Oh.
So in most of them in Oldham, for the first sort of 20-odd years, and then in London for the next 20-odd years or something like that, I think. I really think. I can't remember being away.
Because that's a very salient point. Most of us, unless there's some trauma, you do tend to always... It's like planes, trains and automobiles, isn't it? You have to get home for Christmas wherever in the world you are.
Yeah.
That's the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, and I think millions of people are screaming at the radio, Oldham's exotic.
Well, it is exotic if you're from somewhere else, a far-flung city in some other part of the world. Then the Saddleworth Moors. Oh. What could be more beautiful on Christmas Day?
Oh, thank you. You've painted a very evocative picture there.
Yeah, the wind and
What about
rain.
yours, Shaun?
That's a very good question.
Your most exotic Christmas?
I'll tell you what it was. Thanks for asking. It was broken down in a hard shoulder on the M6 in an M-Reg white Citroen ZX. And I say broken down, I mean it in both senses of the word.
I was going to say you or the car.
Yeah, both.
Yeah.
I think I was waiting for the AA on my way home, like driving home for Christmas, and it all went wrong.
Did you make it? I've got this image of you sat on the hard shoulder at 5 to midnight on Christmas Eve.
Yeah,
Just
okay,
trying
we'll go
to-
with that. Yeah,
Is that what
Yeah.
it was?
Yeah, it was
Tried to-
that.
and then you sort of hitched a lift.
that's exactly.
Got picked up by, and then it all went, yeah.
and then you wouldn't believe what happened next. You just reminded me strangely. I know Phil's probably thinking, when are you going to ask him some questions about music and science? But I'm enjoying myself too much.
This is all going to get cut.
Oh,
you know that,
yeah.
I
because
like
it's
this stuff.
It's rambling, really, isn't it? It's not really very focused.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember when you did the breakfast show, and it was wonderful. It was always like this. It just rambled on.
No, we've come all this way. I'm going to ask you some proper questions. First of all, is it true that time is travelling slightly faster up here than it is on the ground?
Yes.
That's blown a few minds.
Time is, we now know, let's say it gets mixed up with space. There are many ways of explaining this, but essentially what Einstein discovered that nature was telling him, initially just 1905 and subsequently through to 1915 with his general theory of relativity, is that time and space are not separate ideas, they're not separate things. And in fact, in a very real sense, they don't exist in the way that we think of them. So we think that time just ticks and it's universal. And so if everybody had perfect watches and synchronized them now, if we all synchronized our watches now and came back next year, next Christmas, then they would read exactly the same time. And they don't. The time differences between things that happen are essentially subjective. They depend on how you move and relative to each other and so on. And also, to your point, how far away you are from a massive object. So the presence of the Earth itself distorts or changes the way that time and space mix, if you like.
It bends time a little bit, doesn't it?
Well, it's not
the
mixes
massive
it.
object.
It's kind of a point of view. So we separate time and space. So in our mind, so we think time ticks along, and space is the distance between things. But actually, the very idea of distance between points and time differences between events is subjective. And the mixture between the two changes depending on your, what we call frame of reference or point of view. So the upshot of it is, yes, if you're higher up in altitude, then you're in a different, let's say, I could say even a different mixture of space and time, if you like, to the people on the ground. So it's a tiny, tiny effect.
The fact that we've spent the afternoon up here means that when we go down, we'll be just a tiny little bit younger than our partners.
The complication is,
slightly.
though, we're rotating at the moment, and that adds. So we are moving relative to the ground as well, and the roughly, broadly speaking, if we're travelling fast relative to the people on the ground, then time ticks a bit slower for us. But because we're higher in altitude, time ticks a bit faster for us. And so there are two effects you've got to take account of.
Oh.
I suspect that the altitude is winning at the moment because we're not moving very fast.
No, we're not. We're quite glacially around. I'm sort of going to try and put a tiny parameter on the rest of our ramblings, because there's the entire universe to go at, and that's a bit broad. And so whilst we're in the BT Tower, I thought we might stick to stuff about communication, roughly. And so
I can turn anything back to fundamental physics.
This is the part
Well,
of the problem,
communication
isn't it?
happens through electromagnetic waves mainly now, doesn't it? So radio waves,
except in
microwave.
the BT Tower, where we can't get a Wi-Fi signal.
No, we can't.
Mysteriously.
It's absolutely bizarre, isn't it?
Not really. They haven't got a Wi-Fi router up here. It's not.
It's as simple as that.
But that's the thing. So we can turn it back. And actually, the clue that inspired Einstein, or caused Einstein to revise our notions of space and time, came from electromagnetism and the study of light. In fact, his paper, the first paper, is called "On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies."
1905.
Yeah,
Vienna.
So you see, the point is, you cannot deflect me from fundamental physics, no matter what you decide to talk about.
I was thinking about first human communications. I was thinking about the origins of human art. I was reading about the stuff like that. Apparently there's a shell that's 500,000 years old, and on it have been carved some geometric shapes by what would have been like I guess a hominid of some description, an early human, Australopithecus. I don't know my timelines. That's like an early smartphone, isn't it? Is that evidence of an intelligent mind looking for some order in the chaos around them? I mean, what do we glean from an artifact like that?
Well, the first thing is that people had already started to think in symbols by that time. Obviously, if you're drawing something, if you're making marks on something, you're doing it for some kind of reason, to remember something or to record amounts of something, which is what a lot of early writing was about. So clearly people had already learnt that you could externalize information from your own mind. You know, you could put it out somewhere and store it and presumably show it to somebody else. So that's a big step. That's the beginning of communication, actually, that something could come out of your mind and go into somebody else's mind. Have you heard of that book? A very interesting book called The Singing Neanderthals.
No.
It's by a guy, I think his name is John Mithen.
Good Christmas present.
Yes, well, the theory of the book is that singing preceded language. So he talks about humans doing things together with their voices, and his supposition is that, and in fact it's rather well backed up in this book, is that people started off by producing noises together. And then that gradually turned into language. It was sort of focused down into bits of language. I think it's a lovely idea that we started singing before we started speaking.
I mean, this is, everybody knows this. This is like your ABCs. But the acquisition of direct cortical control of the vocal fold musculature and the consolidation of an auditory vocal articulatory circuit encompassing auditory areas in the temporoparietal junction and prefrontal and motor areas in the frontal cortex, this articulatory loop, also referred to as the phonological loop, enhanced vocal working memory capacity, enabling early humans to learn increasingly complex utterances. I mean,
yeah, well,
everybody knows
I
that.
strongly disagree with the loop idea.
What?
You don't know what you said, do you?
No, I don't.
No. I mean,
Thanks, Wiki.
I remember filming actually in we filmed in a cave in northern Spain. I've now forgotten the name of it, but it's some of the oldest cave paintings.
Altamira.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which are handprints, and we went down into the darkness, and one of the interesting things is that the handprints are very deep into the cave system, which would have been an unusual and actually potentially dangerous place for them to go, because there would have been, you know, bears and wild animals down there perhaps, and also very difficult for them to light, because we're talking about, I can't remember how old they are now, but hundreds of thousands.
30,000.
Oh, is it 30,000?
Altamira, yeah.
So you, obviously it's torches, it's fire, so you would have had smoke, and it would have been a very unpleasant place to go. So it was a very strange place to do art, but you don't find it at the cave mouth, where you might think, you know, where everyone lived and did art. It's deep into the caves. So the suggestion was that there's a strong ritual component, because it was difficult to do. And also I think they're all small handprints. I think it was either all females or children or something. They weren't adult male handprints. So there's some sense of ritual involved in the art.
Something about being in the bowels of the earth and some connection to do you think that would almost like early religion maybe, or some kind of significance?
That was a
for
suggestion, so it's probably associated with some a ritual of some kind.
And what they often did with those the drawings was that they took natural features of the cave, like pieces where the rock jutted out, and that would become the belly of the beast that they were drawing. So they very much followed the shapes in the cave when they made the pictures. And then if you illuminate those with a moving flame, as they would have been illuminated, those creatures are animated.
So
they
come
look
alive.
like they're moving.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it could have been a really, really magical experience if you imagine someone being taken into that place, not knowing about it, and suddenly seeing this.
like an early moving picture, really,
Yes.
like the Lumineers or something.
That's right.
Sort of, and also showing an excellent, if indeed they are taking children down there, excellent childcare as well. I mean, I can't get my kids to do anything, really, you know, without bribing them with a massive bag of
without a
toffees.
tablet.
Without a tablet, exactly.
You think about it, it's really sophisticated though, isn't it? Because once you have ritual, or once you have that sense of the supernatural, let's say, or something. It requires you to think there's something else other than the physical world, which it does seem that those sites were associated with that kind of thoughts. But as you said, 30,000 years ago, possibly not Homo sapiens. I think it's debated, I think, basically because we don't know how these different species radiated out from Africa and at what time they were here and so on. But it's possibly Neanderthals.
Yes, that's right. That would have been about the end, sort of coming towards the end of the Neanderthal era, wouldn't it?
What fascinates me is that nexus of time, if that's the right word, between you know, when you have that situation where, and I know it's evolutionary, so it happens over a very long period of time, but those brains that sort of are making the transition into being sentient from being just essentially monkeys, you know, what that must have been like. I know it's not like switching a light on, but you know, that period of time where the brain is becoming larger evolutionarily, and because I think that's the sort of thing that's really happening, isn't it, evolutionarily?
Yeah.
Well, the big change is with the development of what they call theory of mind, where you start to model in your mind what other minds are doing. So, you know, when children are very young, they assume that every mind is exactly the same as theirs. So if they're aware of something, everybody else must be aware of it. And the first stage of growing up is realizing that you can have something in your mind that isn't in somebody else's. That's where humor begins and lying begins and imagination begins. But with animals, so far we know that chimps have quite a limited theory of mind, so they are capable of simple deception, but they aren't capable of the kind of thinking where we might say, I imagine that Brian is thinking that Shaun is about to say something about Phil's family, you know?
Yeah.
Where, in that case, I've got several minds modelled like little Matryoshka dolls, one inside the other, you know?
That empathy.
That's right. So this is something that humans have developed really to quite an extreme event. I think somebody once said to me that there's a place in Shakespeare where in one particular part, there's 7 levels of theory of mind. Somebody thinks that somebody else knows, that somebody else believes, that somebody else imagines, you know. So this is a very uniquely human thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think theory of mind is where we come towards art, actually, where we start to imagine things that deliberately take advantage of the fact that we have different minds from each other, and they're creative. They aren't all the same. They create differently.
It's fascinating to think that moment, those moments in time. Okay, well, we've set the ball rolling with some fundamental thoughts about evolution and communication. Let's have a little tune and then come back to Brian Eno and Cox.
Do you regret it at all? Every time you spend Christmas time in the arms of someone you do not love, who don't love you enough. Are you present at all? Or does he represent everything that could make you appalled? You cannot love, who don't love you enough. Someone who makes
Someone who makes you whole. Someone who takes you by to make angels and stars. Someone who loves you, someone who needs you too, someone who needs you to be, and only this Christmas, this Christmas, this Christmas, this Christmas.
Here with me, Shaun Keaveny, Brian Eno, Brian Cox, up the needle of the BT Tower. Some facts for you about the BT Tower. It was opened by Tony Benn in 1966.
That's a marvellous innovation.
We've already established the restaurant was once run by Butlins. There is a 55-metre concrete pyramid underneath it. And it's 189 metres tall. It was once the GPO Tower, of course, and that's all you need to know. All the way through this broadcast, I have been wearing sunglasses, and that is not because I'm trying to make Brian Eno feel like Bono's in the room. It's because I've lost my glasses, and these are prescription. Have you got anything to say, by the way, on Christmas Day about working with Paul Hewson, a.k.a. Bono? I've mentioned him, I thought
I've never worked with him on Christmas Day, so I can't really address that. In the same spirit as Brian said, I don't have enough data
about Jesus.
Yeah, I was asked when was Jesus born. I just don't know how to calibrate that. I don't know. Right.
It's not your area,
I know
is it,
nothing about it at all.
It's not
I was
his
going to
area.
ask though, what is it? Your question was quite interesting. What is the feeling of Bono being in the room?
Yeah.
That was his question.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question.
Well,
actually.
it's a fair question, yes. I mean, he's a very funny person too, you know. I don't know if you realise that, but he's got a very, very funny humour. And like a lot of good singers I know, he's a really good mimic. So he can do other people's voices really, really well. And then you realise that good singers are people who've spent a lot of time listening to voices, paying attention to voices, and noticing how they can change what they sound like by little tweaks of their voices.
But I would say that singing can be something of a blind spot sometimes because it's something that technically nearly everybody can do to a degree, rather than learning to play a guitar or something.
Yeah. I can't. I'm absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
Well, I can play. You know, I can play. If you give me a keyboard, then I'll pretty quickly work out what.
That's how
if
we're
you play
playing out,
something,
by the
I'll
way.
play it. You know, I can pretty much play it, so I can hear.
Yeah.
Particularly chords, though. That's the thing. I'm a very chord-based person, so I tend to hear chord progressions, whereas melodies seem to be a bit more
Challenging.
difficult for me to pick out.
But that's
just the way
interesting.
my brain works.
So you've got a good pitch, a good sense of pitch, but when it comes to the actual singing part, that's more of a
Chord
challenge for you.
sequences I'll do, so I can hear chord progressions, and I'll pick those out very quickly.
And can you reproduce them if you hear a chord progression?
Yeah, that's what I seem to be able to do, but it's very different for some reason. I don't know why.
But that's it.
melody,
What
and
you-
harmony. I'm not.
I'll tell you an amazing story about. Do you know the musician John Hopkins?
Yeah.
When I was working with Coldplay once, I said, you know what, it'd be good to get this guy John Hopkins in to have a different keyboard player, because you know the way Chris writes, he tends to play with all 10 fingers, and he uses very thick, rich chords all the time. And I thought it would send them in a different direction if somebody else did the keyboard. In fact, one day I tied Chris's hands up. In fact, I taped his fingers up, I think, so that he didn't have so many fingers to play with. Anyway, John Hopkins came in, and the band was working on a song, and Chris was at the other end of the studio playing his usual
Lush chords.
beautiful, thick, lush chords, and quite complicated chords in this case. And he said to John, "Oh, do you want me to show you the chords?" And John said, "No, I know what they are." And I noticed then that John Hopkins had this extraordinary talent for immediately being able to reproduce very, very complex chords. You know, like those sorts of chords that are called things like E minor, ninth, seventh, diminished.
Yeah.
But to go quickly back to singing, it can be a blind spot, can't it? As I say, because people think, well, anybody can sing. But why is it so? Is that why singers who are so good are so well rewarded? Because it's such a unique talent, isn't it? There's a difference between being able to replicate a melody and being able to move people with that melody, isn't there?
Yeah. I'll tell you another good singing story though. When I first worked with Bowie on the Low album, I arrived in the studio and they had already started some work on various songs, and he said, I wrote this song for Dylan. I said, really? Wow, I didn't know you knew him. Anyway, he said, yeah, listen to it. We did a demo of it, and there appeared the best Dylan song I'd ever heard. Amazing song. I said, Jesus, is he going to release this? And everybody in the studio was laughing. And it was actually David's imitation of Dylan doing, you know, I don't know if you remember that song, Always Crashing in the Same Car. His first version of that was a fake Bob Dylan version, but it was so perfect. The fake was so perfect.
It's fascinating to think that somebody like David, of course, he's still in the thrall of these people that went before him, isn't it? You know,
well, it wasn't that long before.
No,
either.
I don't suppose it was.
Well, there is a song for Dylan, isn't there? It's Hunky Dory, isn't it?
Of course.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah.
It's Robert Zimmerman. I wrote this song for you.
Yeah. I must ask then, whilst we're on this subject, about music as communication, okay? So I'm thinking about things like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, going to films now, Star Wars, the Cantina sort of section in there. Can we, because music is maths, and this might be an old question that I'm revisiting, can we infer from this or take from this that aliens will jam with us at some point in the future? Because music is maths and it's interval based and it's about frequencies, can we expect to find music at other parts of the universe?
It's an interesting question. It sort of depends on what sensory organs other beings have. You know, hearing might not be a sense.
Yeah.
There might be all chemical sensors or electrical sensors or something like that.
They might, they might communicate. They might be sentient, but they might not communicate via sound waves at all, or even visual.
And then
things.
Sound itself, if you think about it, what it, I suppose, sounds like depends on the atmosphere.
Yes, sure.
I mean, think about inhaling helium from a balloon and what it does to your vocal cords.
Yeah.
It's a very good example, actually, of the fact that sound of music is a very complex phenomena, isn't it? I mean, it depends. So it's in a sense, what it sounds like is an expression of your relationship with your planet, because it depends entirely what it sounds like to you on your atmosphere.
Is it Jupiter that has a lot of helium?
Yeah, Jupiter, hydrogen, helium. I mean, the universe is essentially hydrogen, helium, about 75% hydrogen, 25% helium, and virtually nothing else.
So you can see where I'm going with this. That you started it, Brian Cox. That it's so possible that somewhere in the universe there is, in the Goldilocks zone, an inhabitable planet, but that has got like a certain amount of helium in the atmosphere and all the.
Very squeaky.
The thing is, it tends to escape. I don't want to go down this route because it's so technical, isn't it? Because it's very light. So the universe is basically, as I said, hydrogen and helium, and yet helium is extremely rare on this planet.
We're running out of helium.
Well, it's very important because and we use it in lots of things, MRI machines, lots of. It's part of a lot of healthcare, for example, in the way, and yet we're running out. Why? When a quarter of the universe is made of it, it's because it's a very light molecule. And so if you put it anywhere, if you put it around on a planet like the Earth, then the helium molecules move around a lot because of the temperature of the Earth, and they escape. So a planet like the Earth, this distance from the Sun, can only hang on to the heavier, more massive molecules in its atmosphere, like nitrogen and oxygen and so on, carbon dioxide. But it was something light, like helium, just escapes out into the universe again. So we're going to probably end up having to mine it in the future.
So how do we do that?
Places. There are deposits of it apparently in the lunar surface, apparently sort of buried down there. But I think ultimately, if you want lots of it, you do go to a gas giant and scoop it up. I mean, it's
was
true
going to
that
say a
Jupiter
party
and,
shop,
but that's. I'm not claiming that's easy to do. It's tremendously difficult.
But that tips us into a whole other conversation about monetizing space, doesn't it? And I'm pretty certain that, and I'm not making a judgment either way on people like Bezos and people like that, but the billionaires and trillionaires, they've got their eye on that as another revenue source, haven't they? Is the outer planets.
Not only that, I think some of them are quite seriously thinking about the collapse of this Earth and possible futures on other planets.
I think that's really dangerous way of thinking.
So do
actually,
I.
because I don't think there's any possibility of us colonising Mars to this extent. To any, I mean, we're looking out over London at the moment. This is never going to happen on Mars.
No.
Mars is a terrible place to live compared to this one. So there are 2 points. The idea that we might go get resources from off the Earth. And actually, you hear Jeff Bezos a lot talking about heavy industry happening in orbit, where there's plentiful solar power, lots of resources in the asteroid belt and so on. Sounds like science fiction. But actually, the idea that you would start to... Ultimately, I've heard him say that his ultimate goal would be to zone Earth residential. The whole thing is a residential zone. Now, that's a wonderful goal.
Yeah, that's a nice
But the
thought.
point is, we're never going to get to the point where we live en masse anywhere else. And I think we have to realise that. Once you realise that even you go 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 10,000 years into the future, most of us, if we are to exist, if humans are still to exist, most of us will be here.
That's
And so
right.
we have to think about this place as what is it going to be like 10,000 years in the future,
It's our
and
back
make
garden.
sure it's okay. And therefore zoning it residential is actually a very good idea. That would be the goal. But the idea you'd move to Mars in anything more than a few hundreds or thousands. I mean, we can check this. So if you're listening to this now, listen to it in Christmas Day 2300 and
See how we
play
did.
it back and see and tell me that I'm wrong. But I'm telling you, Christmas Day 2300, very few of you are going to be listening to this from the surface of Mars.
They'll be looking
Maybe a
back.
handful.
That aged badly. We've got the verdant paradise here in Mars now, actually, Mr. Cox. But he's such a salient point there. I mean, that brings me on to another point, which is, speaking of that, it used to give me some succor that when I was on FM with my radio programs, that they were being, that essentially the radio waves were emanating from the Earth, and that eventually it's possible, a bit like the Voyager spacecraft, that somewhere in deep space they will. Shaun Keaveny here, fantastic, stupid joke about arses. That doesn't happen now apparently with digital audio broadcasting. Apparently our waves no longer go anywhere. I don't really
Is
understand
that
why.
true?
Yeah.
So,
It's
why?
one-
Because they don't cohere or something?
No, it's one of the arguments. The great silence, as astronomers call it, which is this ominous phrase, which is a statement of fact that we've listened for radio waves from other civilizations and we've heard nothing. So you turn quite big radio telescopes up to the sky and hear silence. Now, what does that mean? It may mean that, and I think it's a good operational hypothesis, it may mean that there aren't any civilizations out
Fermi
there.
paradox.
I think we should work on the basis that this is the only planet, to go back to what we've been talking about, the only planet that supports intelligent life and therefore meaning, I would say, in the Milky Way galaxy, and operate on that basis. And then when you operate on that basis, the way that we treat it seems bizarre and irresponsible. But another point, though, is that as you become more digital, if you think about, we're at the BT Tower now, you talked about the 1960s when this was open, we were beaming, we can see at least two transmitters. We can see Crystal Palace over there, a big television transmitter, Alexandra Palace. So it's huge things. But now we use satellites to beam quite narrow signals back in. We don't tend to, it's not very efficient to broadcast vast radio transmissions out, just randomly out into space. And we use optical fibers. So our communication becomes higher bandwidth and much more energy
Targeted.
efficient and careful. And so you stop broadcasting the more advanced you get. And we're doing that now. We don't have massive television transmitters. We still do just, but we won't do. We'll be probably fiber optic in a few a few years, really.
So-
Broadly, I know. If you think about how we watch television, you may be listening to this now. It's very likely you're listening to it on the internet.
Yeah.
Very likely. And that does not radiate signals out into the universe. So it may be that just advanced civilizations become radio quiet.
Well, this is I think it's Geoffrey West, is it, who his solution to the Fermi paradox is that when civilizations reach a certain stage of sophistication, they effectively stop broadcasting. So for a start, they virtualize nearly everything, so they're sitting at home doing things on their own. But the other sort of worrying possibility is that there have been many other civilizations, and that they've all reached the same point that we have, where they've started destroying themselves. Maybe it is intrinsic to civilizations that they become more and more successful, more and more capable of extracting things from the planet, and they cut away at the trunk of the tree that they're living on.
Is part of the concern that it's a very human instinct to think it's not going to happen today, though? Like, I often think about my elderly relatives and people who I know that have died who are very old, and have talked to them about mortality. And what I find interesting about humans is we never think it's going to happen today, though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, well, I might be old, I might be ill, but it's not going to happen today. And that's the way that we manage to stay sane, I suppose. But do we do that as a culture as well?
I think so.
We've got another few years to sort it out.
That's the big danger. The big danger is acclimatization. As there are more floods and there are more wildfires and so on, we do exactly what we're doing of saying, wow, it's pretty hot this year, and as if it's not going to be pretty hot next year. It's going to go back to normal. We're designed to think that things will revert to the norm, but they aren't reverting to the norm.
I think it becomes so inconceivably bad. The idea that we will have to radically change our behaviour in order to keep the climate even so manageable in a sense, and be able to produce enough food for everybody and so on as the climate changes. It's such a challenge that I think it's quite human to just ignore it, because the challenge feels to be too great. And that's why you need careful, reasonable leadership. It ultimately comes, if you in a democracy like this, if you just have a poll, some kind of referendum or something, and say, what do you think we should do about the climate, you won't get anywhere. Because it requires some very powerful and disturbing truths to be accepted. It requires us to accept what the experts are saying, right? Which is a difficult thing when the tone of your society is wrong. If you get into a situation where you are anti-expert, probably because of some other, as we talked about earlier, some other short-term political goal that people have, that actually the knock-on effects are much more serious, because then you get to an existential challenge like climate change, and people say, well, yeah, but you said don't listen to those experts because they've all got some sort of agenda or something, which is, of course, drivel when you're talking about climate.
It goes back to the things we were talking about with the space development. It's long-term thinking over many decades is what we need, rather than quick fixes.
But every technology we've developed in the last few years encourages shorter-term thinking.
Yes.
Reactive thinking. Tweets. What's that all about?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
about bickering, basically.
Bickering
and being nasty to each other. It's never about saying, look, we have to think about this. Let's look at the evidence. Looking at the evidence is considered to be hopelessly old-fashioned and in fact some way leftist.
Yeah.
Looking at evidence is
boring, boring and patriarchal or something.
It is a mystery to me. I know it's Christmas Day and everything, I do notice this on the social media, that because I will say something, and I will mention a current some observation that's been made about the climate, like some average temperatures increasing, or the ice, polar ice diminishing, or whatever it is, and I might react to it, and a good number of people say, "Oh, shut up, lefty."
Yeah.
What's he? There is no connection at all between respecting and trying to understand evidence and data and modelling and your political view.
Yeah.
It is illogical. There is no connection.
Yeah.
So at the moment that a statement of our knowledge, which is what the climate change research is, it's a statement of the current best we can do, our knowledge about the way our climate is changing and the reasons why it's changing. The idea that can become something to do with your politics, which politics is about things like tax rates or how you redistribute,
how the trains run,
opportunity and so on, and different views. There are different views of how to run a society, but the idea that can be equated or attached to a particular view on data is perverse.
It's risible.
You know something's wrong.
Off the back of that, because at this juncture it's time for Brian Eno to bring us back to Christmas like he seems to do every year, just instinctively, because you've got a lovely song to play us now, which is going to take us away from all those problems. We're going to go back in time, and what are you going to play for us?
This is a lovely song called When Was Jesus Born? Brackets, last month of the year. It's by the Heavenly Gospel Singers. I don't know when it was recorded, probably in the 30s or 40s.
It's just a matter of opinion, isn't it?
When was Jesus born? All over the land, money, well, well, now. When was Jesus born? The land, money, whoa. When was Jesus born? The land, money, was it January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, what the 25th day of December, the land, money. Oh, tell me, when was Jesus born? Oh, the mighty by the land, money. Well, well, no. When was Jesus born? The land, money. Oh, when was Jesus born? Well, by the land, money. Was it January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, what the 25th day of December, the land, money. Oh, tell me, when was Jesus born? God Almighty by the land, money. Well, well, no. When was Jesus born? Oh, by the land, money. Oh, when was Jesus born? Well, by the land, money. Was it January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, what the 25th day of December, the land, money. He was born not but a mere, he was wrapped up in the swaddling, laid in a manger, born but the 25th day of December. Talk about the land, money. Oh, tell me, when was Jesus born? God Almighty by the land, money. Well, well, no. When was Jesus born? The land, money. Oh, when was Jesus born? Well, by the land, money. Was it January? I don't know. March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, but the 25th day of December, the land, money. Oh, tell me, when was Jesus born? God Almighty by the land, money. Well, well, no. When was Jesus born? The land, money. Oh, when was Jesus born? Well, by the land, money. The January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, but the 25th day of December, the land, money. Oh, now, but the neighbor, he was wrapped up in the swaddling, laid in a manger, only but the 25th day of December. Talk about the land, money. Oh, tell me, when was Jesus born? God Almighty by the land, money. Well, well, no. When was Jesus born? The land, money. Oh, no, the when was Jesus born? Oh, well, by the land, money. Was it January? I don't know. March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, what the 25th day of December, the land, money.
The Heavenly Gospel Singers. When was Jesus born? Possibly the last month in the year. We're not going to get caught up in that. Now, let me ask another question. We started off talking about, we'd sort of roughly talking about communication. We're up the BT Tower and all that. And we were talking about early humans. We were talking about the imagination of early humans and that nexus between unconscious and conscious minds. Say that we're talking about maybe about 70,000 years ago, the first human communications, the first human art. where could communication be in another 70,000 years? Where will our consciousness take us in that time if we haven't destroyed the human race by then? Because things have changed so much even in the last 30 or 40 years. If we could stay alive for another few thousand years, where are we going to be?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, given the big if, that if we're still here. But what seems to happen in human communication is that we get better and better in encapsulating more and more stuff into simpler and simpler forms. For instance, if you think of just any kind of word like association, that's a big idea. If you try to explain what you mean by the word association, there's a lot of stuff packed into those few simple letters. And emojis, for instance, those are amazingly compact forms of telling you a lot in a very simple image. So I think the development of language is being able to say more and more with less and less. And we keep coming up with ways of doing that. I mean, tweeting, which I hate, is the most recent version of that. That we now have a whole presidency run by tweets.
See, which is saying less and less with more and more fury. It's the definition
true,
of
yes.
Twitter.
Well, that's the thing I've got down here. Has language become weaponized? If it has, what can we do to make it better? What can we do with all this? Because it seems that social media has taken us down a bit of a dark road. Is there something we can do to take ourselves out of that cul-de-sac?
I think about this quite a lot, as many people do, and I think people in positions of power or visible positions, which would include myself and us in that, I think we have a responsibility to be careful with the way that we express ourselves, no matter how annoyed or irritated or angry we get, because I think that it's the sense of, if you think about how running societies is obviously very difficult, tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people trying to operate together. And what we were talking about, actually going back to the origins of human consciousness and art and so on, the story is, I think, of communication is the story of more and more people exchanging ideas and having different points of view. And when you get to tens of millions, I think it's astonishing that we manage it. You know, we're sitting here now looking out across London. The idea that all these millions of people live together in basic harmony, right?
Yes.
This is not the Middle Ages, that it is quite astonishing, but I think it's rather more delicate than we'd thought. And I think a lot of it comes down to tone and the way that those social norms that force us or compel us to interact in a rather gentle way with each other, no matter what our disagreements are being discarded on social media. And I do think that's part of the problem.
Well, I think one of the things that does hold us together is the ability to like the same things, like the same football teams or the same pop records, or we keep creating occasions where more and more humans can share the same experience and feel enthusiastic about it and presumably feel the same kind of way about it. And if you look at the globalization of pop music, where you have now bands that I've never even heard of selling hundreds of millions of records, but nonetheless they're kind of gelling together a huge community of people in some perhaps quite superficial way, but at least that gives it's like the way the English talk about the weather. It's a sort of universal subject that anybody can talk to anybody else about without fear of getting into a fight. Well, pop music is a little bit like that as well.
I mean, it feels a little bit like people fall back to certain ridiculous arguments and positions and say, for instance, things like,
What we need is a good ball to bind us all together.
but you can sort of understand the logic behind an argument like that, in the sense that I guess translated what they're saying is we need to be able to bandy together. It's like everything's become very tribal in the modern media world, like you'd say it. But it's a bit like the film Independence Day, isn't it? And going back to the Fermi paradox and going back to intelligent life. that's perhaps what we do need. Maybe we need to be invaded by an alien species,
Yes. Oh, that would
and then we'd all
certainly
be
help.
on the same side.
But
wouldn't
we are being invaded by an alien species.
Go on.
It's us. It's
Yes.
our future. You know, that we are now living outside the temperature bounds that any human civilization we know of has ever been in before. So we're already in an alien world, actually, and it's going to get more alien. So the only possible upside of that is that it will have that effect of saying, look, we've got to forget national differences or international differences. We have to buckle down and get onto this together.
I've heard that said, actually, that the climate challenge is probably, well, it is the nearest thing we have to a global challenge now.
Yeah.
And as Brian said, there isn't an upside to the climate challenge other than perhaps it will focus everybody to work on that, find solutions to that common problem. That's a key point. It is a global problem.
Yeah.
And it's probably the first global problem. But arguably, I suppose, nuclear war you could have considered, which is still there as a threat. But if you go back to our childhood or my childhood, you know, growing up in the 70s, then that was a present danger, wasn't it? And that was a global challenge. And we, broadly speaking, overcame that. It's still a threat, but it's not the threat it was in the 60s at Cuban Missile Crisis and so on.
Well,
So
that was overcomable in the sense that the climate crisis isn't. You know, whatever's going to happen in climate, a lot of it is already going to happen.
Damage is done. And it's
well, there's nothing we can do to call that back at the moment. So we are going to be into a new world. Yeah. But going back to what you were saying about media, I think what has happened with social media is that it's tended to prioritize the views of the people who live at the extremes, not the bulk of the sort of 84% or so of ordinary people in between who aren't obsessively certain that they're right about something and perhaps are prepared to compromise and to think differently. But the few people at the edges, of course, propel social media. You know, they create the biggest reactions by saying the most objectionable things. And so, because of the way Facebook and so on works, the algorithms continually promote those kinds of views.
The engine of social media seems to be opprobrium, doesn't it? And I was even reading an article which talks about the actual tone, you were talking about tone, the actual tone of voice that people use, and therefore how it's translated into social media makes a big difference. If you start to be panicked by somebody else,
Yes.
then you stop listening,
Yes.
and it sets off your adrenaline. And so that's what they were making the point, that in every part of discourse we need to try and climb down and calm down so we can hear the other person. So
The thing is, if you want radical change, then it's hard to achieve quickly unless you radicalize or make angry a large enough group of people. It's an easier way to get radical change quickly, I think. In the short term, the problem is that history has taught us, if it's taught us one thing, it's that it doesn't work in even the medium term. But it's an easy route. And I really do criticise many, not all, but many of our current generation of politicians, because I think they've forgotten that whilst, yes, it is easy to if you can antagonise or annoy or fire up 20 or 30% of the population, which is quite an easy thing to do, then you can get your way for a short amount of time. The problem is that they should be wise enough to know that you don't get your way for very long doing that. You just end up with a bunch of angry people.
But the problem is that the media are so drawn to those people because they're so entertaining.
Yes.
You know, take America now, where Trump has so much airtime, and yet a thinking politician like Elizabeth Warren struggles to get anybody to listen to.
What I would say, though, is I think we're dragging everybody down on Christmas Day.
That's true. And
But
so,
the point is, though, I think that there are signs of optimism in the sense that I think large numbers of people are now beginning to realise that whilst the angry mob, for want of a better word, might even support our political position, I think increasing numbers of people are beginning to think, well, that's not the way to get your way in a democratic and stable society.
And also, I agree with you. The other thing I think that's starting to happen is that lots and lots of people who thought they were isolated activists are starting to notice that everybody else is an activist as well. There's a huge movement afoot. I mean, it has obviously very visible instances like Extinction Rebellion, but there are so many people now who are affiliated with different causes, doing different things around this subject of climate change. And of community change, actually. And in fact, I think they're gradually replacing government. I think this is how societies change, actually, that the thing that we used to call the government gradually fossilizes in place. It can't do anything for various reasons. It's ineffective. And so people take over and they start doing things themselves. And first of all, they're called activists, then they're called NGOs, then they're called, finally they become the government, actually.
So it's a bit like a child suddenly realising that their parent is incapable of looking after them, and so they sort of have to get themselves ready for school.
Yes,
that's essentially what we're talking about.
And then gradually they become the parents.
Yeah. And what a wonderful thought, and thanks for bringing it round back to optimism, because my default position, of course, is catastrophization. So that's a nice thing to think about.
So it's a Muse album, that, isn't it?
Catastrophization out on Monday, I think, or is it Friday? Get it for Christmas. Yeah. I mean, basically, I just think that everybody needs, or whatever side of the political spectrum you are, more hugs. That's my prescription, Dr. Shaun. We're going to break for a song. I would like Come Together by the Beatles, seeing as though it's 50 years since Abbey Road came out, and it just seems appropriate.
Yeah, good idea.
Come Together by the Beatles, Abbey Road, 50 years ago. Let's go really sort of cheesy, obvious music for a moment and say, the Beatles, You sort of mentioned off the back of that it was a song you didn't really get when it first came out, Brian Eno.
No, I didn't like it, really.
Did you not?
No. I was a bit of a snob about my music, and I thought, why make this kind of retro music? Because, this is the same band who'd made I Am the Walrus and Strawberry Fields Forever and so on.
Just 2 years before.
Yeah, these amazing, completely new forms of music. And then I thought, why do crappy R&B records?
What, Abbey Road?
I've sort of changed my opinion about that now, because I'm a little bit less of a snob than I was, at least about that. But I still think it was not their greatest moment.
No, I think innovation-wise, I can totally get where you're coming from there, because it is like a sort of, it's a retrospective step back for John Lennon, isn't it? He's thinking, we've been through so much. I was happiest when we were playing, like, with
The
Rory
Star
Storm
Club
and the
in Hamburg.
Hurricanes and stuff. I get that. I mean, actually, this gives us an opportunity to flim-flam around a little bit and talk about music and talk about things like For All Mankind and Apollo Atmospheres. This is the stuff that For All Mankind was a fantastic film about the moon landings, of course, that you and your brother did the music for.
Yeah.
Actually, before we go into it, I'd love you to tell the story about when you pranked your brother when you were working with him. Because didn't you and Daniel Lanois dress up as sort of 60s?
God, yes, that was such a funny
60s
story.
drug-addled nut bars to go and pick him up from the airport.
From the airport, yeah. We spent about a day rehearsing it, finding new ways of walking and everything. And so there was me. I've forgotten my name at that time.
Your character name.
I had octagonal blue sunglasses and one of those kinds of moustaches that droops down the side of your face onto your chest,
Midnight Cowboy.
That kind of thing, yes. And Dan was dressed as a man called Louis Belson. Louis Belson, I found out later, was a jazz drummer, but Dan had found this pair of purple bowling shoes that must have been 19 inches long. And they looked so ludicrous. But he practiced walking in them, so they looked completely natural to him. Anyway, we met my brother, who was at that time 19 or 20. First time he'd been to North America, and we met him at the airport. He was a bit disorientated.
So he's jet lagged. He's never been to North America before. He's expecting you to come and pick him up, but these two characters turn up instead.
That's right. Saying Brian sent us because we were coming from the airport anyway. He's busy in the studio. And I should think I spent at least 15 minutes with my brother before he recognized me. We did the whole thing really well. Wigs and accents and ways of walking and habits, you know. Took a whole day of studio time.
I think there's something important in there about how levity can inform gravity, really, when it comes to making music. Because a lot of your stuff is, it might be a mistake, but people perceive it as being very lofty a lot of the time and very cerebral. But you're arsing about quite a lot whilst you're making this music, aren't you, Brian?
Quite a lot, yeah. Yeah. In fact, I think if the arsing about bit leaves, then you might as well give up, really.
Is that really like half the joy of it, the arsing about?
I think arsing about is another form of imagination. Like humour is a form of imagination. And if you're in an imaginative mode, you will be firing in all sorts of ways at the same time, and some of them are very funny. I mean, the funniest time I ever had in the studio was with working with David Bowie making the album Low. Now, Low is quite a dark album in many ways. Austere, yes. But all I remember is that most of the time we were cramped over with laughing between working on things, you know.
Pete and Dud style, wasn't it? I think
that's right. Pete and Dud we used to do.
I mean, it was, keeping it space for a little bit, and Space Oddity, when that came out, I mean, that was kind of before you knew him, wasn't it, I suppose? Yeah. 69, but that was around the time you were thinking that Come Together was a bit rubbish. But you know, you're starting your musical journey. What did you both think of that? I guess I'm grasping towards trying to mix the music and the astronomical here a little bit, because it just felt like that was the time, wasn't it? You're obviously. What were your thoughts about the moon landing at that time, and about, you know, the culture of the time? It's a bit of a broad question, I suppose.
Well, were you alive then?
Yeah, just.
Okay. Do you
March
remember
3rd, 1968? No. I remember it only in the sense that my dad was interested, so he'd kept the newspaper covers and things like that. And there was one of the photographs from, I think it must have been the Daily Express. That's what he used to have, and it was in July 1969 on the wall. So I remember growing up in a house that had these images on the wall.
Why was your dad interested?
I don't know. He wasn't a scientist. It just must have captured his imagination at that time, as I suppose it did for most people. Yeah. And he remembered it very vividly. The first one I remember is Apollo-Soyuz, actually, which is 1975. Yeah. That link-up, the first link-up with the Soviet Union, as it was then, and the United States.
And that sort of gives us a glimpse into how, with using things like science, you can traverse these cultural issues and work above those internal sort of earthbound political difficulties, can't you?
It's one that when you speak to astronauts today who are on the International Space Station as we speak, they often say space has been an arena of cooperation. Even in the 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, mm-hmm. You know, Apollo-Soyuz was important. That they realised that they had to collaborate in space, and so they designed a docking adapter which would allow the Apollo capsule to dock with the Soyuz capsule, and so on, which is really the foundation of the International Space Station today, which is still probably the only example that I can think of successful international engineering at that level. You know, where yes. You really do have Russia and the US, not China at the moment on that, and the Europeans working together on a single, probably the most complicated engineering project we've ever managed and ever achieved. And that's important because it's the only way that you can do it, really.
And now the Russians and Chinese are working together, aren't they?
Yeah, so I think space...
Mostly on defence, but they are...
It has been an arena of cooperation. You're right, the Star Wars in the 70s, the Reagan's initiative. So it always has been, I think.
Oh, you're right. Actually, I suppose that all the Apollo stuff, it started as defence, didn't it, in a sense, or a space race?
Well, you think where it
try and beat
started,
the Russians.
Werner von Braun.
Yeah,
From the American
in Germany
perspective.
Yeah.
It started in Germany.
So
in that particular instance.
but nice to think that from something as dark as that can come something as inspirational as the Apollo missions and beyond, I suppose.
Well, your smartphone is an example. Every major technology in your smartphone was developed by DARPA, which is a Defence Advanced Research Project Agency. So it was all that stuff like GPS and haptic responses and so on were developed.
Recognition as
facial
well.
recognition. They were all developed as military technologies, and this I think highlights one of the very interesting facts about capitalist governments, or so-called free enterprise-based governments, which is that they have to have at their core, to be able to work, a kind of command economy, a basically communist economy. That's why they can do things in defence, because A, the government is willing to commit money to very long-term projects that might not have any result at all, or might only have one in 30, 40 years. Like GPS took decades to develop. And B, there's no real democratic oversight of the defence projects, because they're secret by definition. So it just means the scientists and the military people can get on with them without having to worry about Parliament or Congress.
It's a very important point, that I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier about curiosity and the great fruits of human endeavour tend to come from non-directed or not particularly directed avenues.
Yes.
And arts, undoubtedly, but I think it's true in science and engineering as well. It's when you, as you said, it's interesting with the words you use, because democratic oversight sounds like a really positive thing, doesn't it? But actually, you're right, I think, that when you're talking about cutting-edge research and development, the idea that, and we see it in universities all the time, the idea that you have to be accountable for every pound that you spend. And I often say to people, what do you mean by accountability, actually? Accountable to who and for what end? To what end? What do you actually want of universities? I mean, I think universities are the part of the foundation of our civilization, obviously, and part of the necessary structure of a successful democratic society. But they're places where people are paid to dream, really.
Yeah.
And how can you be accountable for your dream? What was the accountability of dreams? You know, the idea is to think as broadly as you possibly can, and the idea that we spend a little bit of our money on allowing dreamers to exist in our society seems to me to be a good idea.
Yeah, it's a good investment if you want to use that capitalistic way of looking at
and
things.
you know, you can swing it around and say, well, you know, but why should we pay you to dream big thoughts when I'm working away to pay tax in order to give you you can see that it's I can see the challenges to it.
Yeah.
But ultimately the benefits that you get from allowing as many people as possible, actually, ultimately, we've talked about this before, haven't we? The dream of our society would be that all the menial tasks are done by robots, essentially, and everybody can be human, because being human is something that's intangible. I don't know what the word is a wonderful thing to be, and that's where creativity comes from and where we advance our societies. But at the moment, the way that it is, I think that I recoil when we have targets in universities. So you have to submit this research grant and say, and this is what the outcome is. Bizarre. You know, what's the outcome going to be? I don't bloody know.
Especially
it's like that's the point. It's research.
Especially if you're looking at things like pure maths, where sometimes the outcome doesn't happen for 100 or 150 years, or even ever. There are some areas of maths research which are still very much alive, and they're exciting, and they've never had a real world outcome yet, but perhaps they will, you know.
But it's so important to have the opportunity. Let's stop for another bit of music, actually, and obviously immediately after this we're going to come back to Brian and Brian.
BBC Radio 6 Music.
Yellow G. This is Jessica Hines.
Hey, I'm Kate Tempest.
Hey, what's going on? I'm Little Sims.
This is 6 Music's 3 Wise Women. This Christmas, for one night only, we are in control.
Each curating a night on BBC Radio 6 Music.
Spreading some love and good vibes. You know how it goes.
Woo!
6 6 Music. Getting to be the boss for an evening is great.
I'm so happy to have the opportunity to sit here and just play loads of amazing music.
I'm actually living my DJ fantasy.
Digging deep into the BBC archives
To shine a light on the tunes and the artists we love.
Wise Women.
giving you the gift of 6 Music remixed and rearranged
By me.
by me
Continues with Jessica Hine this afternoon from 4.
on BBC Radio 6 Music.
6 Music.
Christmas Day with Shaun Keaveny, Brian Eno, and Brian Cox.
They call me backdoor Santa. I make my runs about the break of day. They call me backdoor Santa. I make my runs about the break of day. Oh, oh, oh. I make all the little girls happy while the boys are out to play. Look at here. I ain't like old Saint Nick. He don't come but once a year. Oh, 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 oh. I ain't like old Saint Nick. He don't come but once a year. But look at here. I come running with my presents every time you call me dear. Look at here. I keep some change in my pocket in case the children at home. I give them a few pennies so that we can be alone. I leave the back door open so if anybody smells a mouse and would know Santa be in trouble if ain't no chimney in the house. They call me back door Santa. I make my runs about the break of day. Look at here. I make all the little girls happy while the boys are out to play. That's what they call me, backdoor Santa. That's what they call me. They call me backdoor Santa. That's what all the girls call me. I give them all the presents. That's what they call me. They call me backdoor Santa. And I like them to call me that. They call me back.
Radio 6.
Little by little by little.
Another decade comes to a close.
Go ahead and shake it if you want to.
To a series of Martin Freeman shows.
Turn it up, bring the noise.
As we celebrate 60 years of musical joys.
You can expect to hear music from Aretha Franklin, the Beatles, Alabama Shakes, Laura Nero, David Bowie, Bob Marley and the Wailers, all sorts.
Martin Freeman's Decades.
Say the magic words.
Tunes that I genuinely love.
6 shows, each dedicated to a single decade.
Starting with the 60s, tomorrow afternoon from 1.
6 Music.
Christmas Day with Shaun Keaveny, Brian Eno and Brian Cox.
Merry Christmas, baby. Should it treat me nice? Merry Christmas, baby. Should it treat me nice? You bought me a diamond ring for Christmas. I feel like I'm in paradise. I feel mighty fine, y'all. I got music on my radio. Feel mighty fine, girl. I got music on my radio. Oh, oh, oh. I feel like I wanna kiss you standing beneath that mistletoe. Santa came down the chimney, 3:30, y'all. Left all them a good old present for my baby and for me. Ha ha ha. Merry Christmas, baby. Should it treat me nice? You bought all those good old presents. I love you, baby, rest of my life. Merry Christmas, girl. Merry, Merry, Merry Christmas, baby. Should it treat me nice? Merry Christmas, baby. I said you should it treat me nice. You bought me all everything, yeah. I feel like I'm in paradise. I wish you a Merry Christmas, baby. Happy New Year, huh? Merry Christmas, honey. Everything here is beautiful. I love you, baby, for everything that you give me. I love you, honey.
Ho, ho, ho. It's Christmas Day. We're at the top of the BT Tower with Brian Eno and Cox, like you do. It's by this time of the afternoon. Let's do our predictions. I'm probably quarter of a bottle of port down by now, I imagine. We are probably in the middle of our Christmas dinner or lunch, whichever you prefer to describe it as. And the older I get, the more I look forward to a few Christmas specials, all the usual sort of cliches, really. What about you guys? What's Christmas looking like this year? Is it another Oldham Christmas, Brian Cox?
It'll be...
You don't have to tell us where you'll be because you don't want the paps there.
It may well be an Oldham Christmas. There's nothing better than an Oldham Christmas.
I've not done one yet, I think.
Oldham Christmas. You should pop up.
I will pop up. You'll be really upset when I do turn up with my little overnight case. You'll be like, I wasn't serious, Shaun.
And a 2-month-old baby.
Yeah, there will be that. Yeah,
that's my little Christmas.
That's what
present.
you're doing at the moment, actually, isn't it? You're actually your fantasy of a quarter of a bottle of port down,
it's not
snoozing in
happen,
front of Morecambe and Wise or whatever it is. No, you're going to be changing nappies, aren't you?
I'm going to be covered in sick, but for once, not my own, which makes a difference.
Lovely image, especially people listening to this during Christmas dinner.
Have yourself a merry little Christmas. And what, Brian?
That's one of my favourite Christmas songs. That
is it?
Oh, it's a great song.
It's a good song. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should it? What about All I Want for Christmas Is You and Whatever You Got Me, Baby by Shaun Keaveny, 2015, with Rod Stewart on backing vocals?
Oh,
Where do you
yes.
stand on that one?
That's true.
You did the
pretty good,
Mariah Carey song.
Due for a re-release, I think.
so. No, I know. Well, that's one of the. I took it to a music publisher. Let's talk about me for a moment, because I thought it was really good. And the music publisher said, "It's a great song, actually. What's it called again?" I said, "All I Want for Christmas Is You." She said, "Do you know that there's a Mariah Carey song that's called that?" I said, "Yes, I know, but it's totally different." She said, "It doesn't matter. It's called the same thing and it's got the same lyric in it, so it will never be able to be used."
Yeah, I mean, I've written this play. It's called Macbeth. Hang on.
There's a problem with it. There's another Macbeth.
Yeah, I've written Beethoven's Ninth here. I'm sure it's not misleading.
When people search it, they seem to be playing the wrong one. Mr. Eno, what's your? Is it going to be a traditional Christmas this year that we're experiencing right now?
I was sort of thinking about a Christmas in Lowestoft, on the east coast, overlooking the sea. I like the sea in the winter.
I like
especially the North Sea, because it's so kind of browny grey. I like that cold weather.
Yeah, I agree. There's nothing nicer than being well wrapped up with the spume in your face.
As spume, as the Swedes say, there's no such thing as bad weather. There's just bad clothes.
Thank you. A nice parka would be good at this time of day. Yeah. And so it's what reflections have you on personally and professionally on 2019, and what can we look forward to from you both in 2020?
For me, it's the craziest year of my life so far. I mean, the world has been crazier than I've ever seen it before. I never really thought that people could lie on a global level like this without any hint of embarrassment at all, and that the people around them could let them carry on doing it as well, because the shock about Trump is not Trump, it's the rest of the Republican Party, that they all fell in line.
Actually, to make it a bit more cosmic again, just for a moment, there was a re-release of your Apollo record, wasn't there, as well this year?
Yeah.
Was that a pleasant experience to revisit?
It was. It was very interesting to sort of project your mind back to that time when the future still looked like it was going to be better. It really was. I could so remember the mindset of thinking, well, of course there are going to be bumps in the road, but basically the graph is going up. And I don't think any of us believe that now, except possibly Steven Pinker, who is still selling books on that basis.
I don't know. I think that I think at the moment what we're seeing is the inevitable playing out of things, the rise of the internet. You know, there's some delay in these things, and the internet is only really, I suppose,
20 years old and a bit.
I mean, 30, I suppose, technically, but really in our consciousness,
general
maybe
use as well,
15, 20 years old. And so I think we're seeing that disruption playing out. And I don't think that I think there's all to play for at the moment. I don't think we know quite. We're trying to adapt to this new world of essentially hearing everyone's voice. I think that's ultimately what it is. I think that if you go back 20 or 30 years, there were very few voices, and they were filtered, and broadly speaking, there was some sense of responsibility amongst the people that had the ear of the public. I think in general, you can argue about it. You can point to people like Nixon, I suppose, and so on in democracies, and say there were issues, obviously. But I think that we're seeing the playing out of a new way of people interacting, and we don't know how to do it yet. And our democratic systems that are essentially, I suppose 19th century setups, broadly speaking, aren't they? You know, maybe a bit earlier, but I think that they have yet to adapt. And so we're seeing this tension. So I'm not completely pessimistic, because I think that one thing that we do learn about countries like Britain or the US is that we do go through these seismic changes, and sometimes we come through and sometimes we don't. You could point to the 1930s and say, well, we didn't really come through that. And so I suppose
I think I'm either totally pessimistic or totally optimistic, in the sense that I think if we do get through it, in order to have done that, we will have had to rethink society so much to rethink what we do with technology, whether we direct it or let it run free like we have done for the last 40 years, whether we have different sorts of global relationships, you know, and we agree that as a people, as a species, we have to cooperate, just like the space race did. We have to cooperate above national differences. So if we succeed in those things, we will have made a really promising new world.
Yes.
But if we fail, the failure will be really bad.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think we're at a high stakes moment. There's no, and you know, I think I agree with you. In my lifetime, I don't remember such a moment. I suppose the closest would be the 1930s, certainly for the world, and that was a high stakes moment, and we did not navigate that successfully. Those tensions in the 30s. So, but then we navigated the Cold War. We navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
So I think we're at one of those moments.
This is our version of optimism, isn't it? On Christmas Day. I mean,
sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But
I would add to it though that I was in the chemist yesterday, and there was a lady picking up a prescription, and she had to give her date of birth, and it was the 30th of the 8th, 1939, I think. And I just thought, you're still here. You were born at the beginning of the Second World War, by some distance the most horrifying thing that's ever happened to the globe, and sort of you survived it and got through it, and here you are picking up a prescription in 2019, you know, and I had to glean some optimism from it, because I've got kids in the world. I had to sort of think, Shaun, stop crying, you're in a chemist, it's going to be okay. So that's my little moment of optimism.
I think it's not going to be okay unless we pay attention. Actually, I think we are at this moment for two reasons. One is the democratic crisis caused by, I suppose, partly caused by the way technology operates and so on, and the second one is climate.
Yeah.
And they both require some serious focus. But then I'm optimistic in the sense that I think it is within our capacity to do something about both those problems. Well, it has to be in a way.
Yeah.
Because I
think that Mark Linus book, 6 Degrees. Do you know that book? It's a book. He's a very interesting environmentalist, and he sort of works out what happens with 1 degree warming, what happens with 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. And what becomes clear from reading that book is that, as you say, every single tenth of a degree is worth fighting for, because things get catastrophically worse at 4 degrees as opposed to 3 degrees, you know. So it isn't an either-or situation, actually. It isn't either we'll fight climate change or we won't. We have to just keep doing it and hoping that we can tame it, really.
Finally...
That wasn't very optimistic either, was it?
Well, don't worry.
We're trying hard here. Brian and I are trying to put up a good front.
Let me finish with this. Okay, it's Christmas Day, and I have invited you around to my house for Christmas dinner. Forget the fact that would be weird, and that your friends and family would be thinking, why aren't you spending Christmas with me? Why are you spending it with a radio personality? You turn it down, but say you didn't for some reason. What 3 courses would you most love to eat on Christmas Day? Your starter, what would you like in the main meal, and what would you finish with? And also, what would you like to drink? Brian Eno.
Well, the thing that I always miss in these sort of big celebrations is anything fresh and crisp and green. It's all to do with sog, isn't it?
Yeah.
And gravy and suet.
Roasted within an inch of its life.
Yeah. So I would like something probably Japanese for my Christmas dinner.
Writing it down. Something Japanese.
Something crisp and fresh and not too fattening.
So we're having a sushi Christmas dinner for Brian.
Sushi for me, yeah.
Just as an accompanying beverage, would it be something
ginger
like...
beer?
Okay, perfect. Well, I haven't had a drink for 8 days, so that's easy for me. I'm feeling very virtuous.
8 days, 4 hours, 16 minutes, and 25. Yeah, let's see.
Not counting or nothing. And Mr. Cox.
No, I disagree most profoundly, and I'm going to tweet it afterwards in very strong terms. No, I went out the other day, and we had for dinner, and we had roast chicken, chips, and bread sauce.
Oh, wow.
And gravy.
Chicken,
and it was
chips.
fantastic.
On a
But
cold
bread
day.
sauce
That's
came.
a nice meal.
And it was wonderful. And I just thought, so I just, which is completely opposite of what you said, but it feels like Christmas Day.
Yeah.
So I'd probably go for that. It was brilliant. But the bread sauce was the thing, because I hadn't had bread sauce for ages.
I completely concur. I had bread sauce last weekend for some reason. And I tell you what I always think about when I think of bread sauce is it's a solid that's kind of a liquid. It's like having a loaf of lager, isn't it? It's completely insane. Bread sauce, pourable bread. It doesn't get more weird than that, does it?
It's a little bit like those chip sandwiches, you know, where you have. In fact, there's a little place on Portobello, Goulburn Road, a guy who fries fish there, a Portuguese guy, and with your fish, which is very good and very cheap, you also get chips, rice, bread,
all the carbs,
and some other form of carbohydrate, couscous. It's incredible. I mean, a display of the world's carbohydrates.
Yeah, my muffin top's just expanded half an inch just hearing that.
When I used to go to the chippy, I used to have steak and kidney pudding, which would be suet pastry, half chips, half rice, and curry sauce poured over the top of it.
You remember when you were young
Pudding
and you
chips,
could eat whatever you wanted?
Pudding, half chips, half rice.
Wasn't it
curry
great?
sauce. So maybe I'd have that for Christmas.
All right
dinner.
then. Right. Okay. I've made the order. In it goes. As always.
And sushi afterwards.
And sushi as at the end. A palate cleanser. Thank you so much to Brian Eno and Brian Cox for accompanying us again, holding our hand through Christmas. We've taken as usual, quite a circuitous and quite a universal journey. We have touched upon some quite disturbing elements of modern reality, but I think we've brought it round to quite a comfortable carbohydrate-based place, and that's the best place to finish. I hope you have a fantastic actual Christmas day, whatever you're doing. But we do have to finish on a song, of course. Mr. Eno has chosen a fantastic one from the Heavenly Gospel Singers, and I think we're going to stay in that realm, aren't we, for the very last song from Brian Cox. Why have you chosen this one to finish on?
Well, I was given, it's when we were filming, and my sound recordist gave me an album called Like an Atom Bomb, which is sort of celebratory apocalypse songs. So songs from the 1950s celebrating the apocalypse. And I thought because it's Christmas, we should also find one that also celebrates the spirit of Christmas. So there's a song on the album called Jesus Hits Like an Atom Bomb, which you know it, don't you?
Yeah.
It's by, who's it by?
Lal Blanchard.
Lal Blanchard. And it's just this very strange mood that people must have been in the 1950s, which is one of optimism and astonishment at the power of technology, but also the dark cloud of annihilation hanging above us. And I thought at Christmas, then this would be a collision of ideas from which a better future may emerge.
That seems perfect in so many diverse ways, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To finish with this, Jesus hits like an atom bomb, ladies and gentlemen. Let's hope we're all still here next year. The Roaring 20s. Thank you very much, Brian Eno, Brian Cox. I've been Shaun Keaveny. Take it away, Lal Blanchard.
Everybody's worried about the atomic bomb, but nobody's worried about the day my Lord will come, when he'll hit great God Almighty like an atom bomb. When he comes, when he comes. In 1945, the atom bomb became alive. In 1949, the USA got very wise. They found a country across the line had an atom bomb of the very same kind. The people got worried all over the land, just like folks got in Japan. So I say, everybody's worried, about the atomic bomb, but nobody's worried, about the day my Lord will come, when he'll hit great God Almighty like an atom bomb. When he comes, good Lord, when he comes. about the atomic bomb. But nobody's worried about the day my Lord will come, when he'll hit great God Almighty like an atom bomb. When he comes, when he comes. But God told Elijah he would send down fire from on high. He told the brother Noah by the rainbow sign, there'll be no water but fire in the sky. Now don't get worried, just bear in mind, seek King Jesus and you shall find peace, happiness, and joy divine with my Jesus in your mind. So I say, everybody's worried, yeah, about the atomic bomb, but nobody's worried about the day my Lord will come, when he'll hit great God Almighty like an atom bomb. When he comes, great God, when he comes. Everybody's worried about the atomic bomb, but nobody's worried about the day my Lord will come, when he'll hit great God Almighty like an atom bomb. When he comes, when he comes.
6 Music. Christmas Day with Shaun Keaveny, Brian Eno and Brian Cox.